People, what was the craziest moment that exposed a psychopath in your family? I have a cousin who's always been a bit off. We live in a big city, but he never really leaves his family's apartment. He just stays there, drawing and playing games. Despite his quirks, I didn't mind much because he was usually very sweet and harmless, or so I thought. One time, when I was in college, I took him and a friend to a concert. We had a few drinks, and when we got back, we hung out in his living room while his parents were out of town. He started sketching in his notebook, and I asked him to see what he was drawing. It was an incredibly detailed drawing of me sitting there. I flipped through the rest of the pages, finding all sorts of cool creatures and landscapes, until I landed on a drawing of his brother. The image was disturbing, his brother, cold and gone with quite graphic details. I turned the page, and there was another drawing, my dad, being offed in the same way. Turned the page again. There I was like my father and his brother. I was frozen in shock. I asked, "What the hell is this? Why would you draw our family like this?" He just quietly responded, "I think about it all the time. I think about offing you and the rest of them all the time." My friend and I exchanged terrified glances, both of us immediately thinking about how we could leave. We were barefoot, and our stuff was downstairs. He could tell we were upset, and he seemed disappointed, like we were trying to provoke him. "Are you scared?" he asked, as he moved to the kitchen. To leave the apartment, we would have to pass through the kitchen. My mind raced, wondering if he was going to grab a knife or something. I tried to mask my fear and said, "No, they're really good. Just surprised me at first. But they're impressive." I had to play along to avoid making the situation worse, and to make sure we could get out of there safely. Since then, he's never done anything like that again, but whenever he drinks or smokes weed, he gets really weird and creepy. I told my parents what happened, but they just shrugged it off and said, "Wow, that's strange." Before we continue, do us a quick favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. After my mom's divorce, she started dating a guy who turned out to be pretty unhinged. We moved into an apartment, and not long after, he moved in with us. He had long hair, blue eyes, and a beard, and looked exactly like the stereotypical image of white Jesus. And when a few people pointed out the resemblance, he really took it to heart. One day, he pulled me aside and told me he had a secret. He said I couldn't tell anyone because the government was after him. He went on to explain that he was actually Jesus Christ, and that he had escaped from a government facility in 1964. He said the Pope had helped him break out during a visit to the US, using the Pope's private security force to get him out. Once he was free, the Pope advised him to blend in with normal people, to avoid attention, and to perform no miracles. But he trusted me enough to share this with me. Apparently, Jesus Christ had become a roofer. He always carried around his roofing hammer. And then one day, it went missing. That's when he completely lost it. He locked my mom, my girlfriend, and me in the apartment until the hammer was found. This lasted for 3 days. I was 18 at the time, much bigger than him, and could have easily physically removed him from the apartment. But my mom insisted he was having a mental breakdown, and that if I did anything, it might make things worse. It turned out that he had left the hammer, which was essentially a hatchet, at a job site, and a coworker drove over to return it. I watched this guy take the axe from the coworker and just handed it over to him. It was a big mistake on my part. The 3-day lockdown turned into 5. The last 2 days were spent listening to this guy, who couldn't read, try to read aloud from the Bible. He got about 1 word out of every 5 right. You know, when the teacher would have people read aloud in school, and there was always that one person who couldn't read, so their part took forever? Imagine that for 2 days straight. The only food he'd let us eat was bread and water, and the bread ran out fast. On the 5th day, he was staring out the blinds at the lake outside the apartment and called me over. He told me, "You know, I could walk across that lake and go straight into heaven." I replied, "If you do that, I'll follow you anywhere. Go for it. I'd love to see you do that." My plan was to get him out of the apartment and lock the door behind him, so my mom and girlfriend would be safe. Then I'd run to a payphone and call 911. He looked at me, his eyes wild, and shouted, "You trying to get me caught, mother FER?" I said no miracles. He raised his roofing hammer, telling me that if I was going to follow him, it would only be in the afterlife. That was when it hit me. I wasn't just scared for myself. I was afraid he was going to hurt my mom and girlfriend. I suddenly didn't care if his breakdown was going to get worse because of me. It wasn't my problem anymore. He was ranting about some religious nonsense, standing inches from my face. Without thinking, I swung and punched him in the sternum as hard as I could. The blow threw him off balance, and he fell backward over a dining chair. He crumpled in a heap, gasping for air. My mom, ever the calm one, screamed at me for hitting him. She thought I had somehow offed him. Later, I'd realized my mom wasn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. My girlfriend bolted out the door, and I grabbed my mom's arm, dragging her with me as we ran out. I called the police, and they showed up to take him away. The last I heard, he was in the hospital after locking himself in a bedroom, still insisting he was Jesus. He had to be committed after he used a metal dart to try and inject something into his veins. Never did get to see him walk across that lake, though. Story 3. I had been dating this guy for a few months, and things were going really well. Then, we both ended up having to relocate for work around the same time. He suggested we try long distance, and it was working surprisingly well. Calls most days, watching movies together, navigating time zones as best we could. Everything felt steady. Then, completely out of the blue, he tells me he doesn't want to be together anymore. No warning. Just, I'm done. I was pretty blindsided, but okay, life goes on. About a month later, he starts begging me to take him back. Like, dramatic rom-com levels of effort. He sent flowers to my job, mailed handwritten letters almost daily across literal thousands of miles, and even bought me a plane ticket to come see him. I figured, why not? Worst case scenario, I get there, he's a jerk, and I just leave early. So I flew out 2 days later. He picks me up from the airport and is instantly acting like his old self, super sweet, telling me he regretted breaking up the moment he did, how I'm the love of his life, etc. We stayed at his family's house because he insisted I shouldn't waste money on a hotel, saying he already feels terrible about everything. The first couple of days went fine. Then, I get an alert on my phone. There's a hurricane coming, and my return flight gets pushed back 4 days. I started stressing because I only took a few days off work. When he comes home, I tell him, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I know. We already started boarding up the windows." A little unsettling, but I assumed that was standard hurricane protocol. The next morning, he wakes me up and tells me to come into the living room. I go out there, and his entire family is sitting down, his mom, dad, sister, and 2 brothers. And he's holding a binder. They sit me down, and one by one, each family member reads a passage from this binder about why we shouldn't be together. Then, in the middle of this bizarre family intervention/staging, he breaks up with me again. During a hurricane, in a blackout, at his parents' house, with no way to leave for 4 more days. Not the most psychopathic person I've ever met, but definitely the most surreal breakup of my life. Edit. The actual most psychopathic person was a kid from high school whose entire family peed in the bathtub. The toilet was strictly for number 2. Story 4. My ex-fiancé once told me that if I ever got pregnant with a girl before a boy, he would push me down the stairs to cause a loss, aka miscarry, over and over, until we got it right. That was the beginning of the end. I broke up with him not long after. Sometime later, he convinced me to meet and talk things over. I got into his car, thinking we'd have a conversation, maybe some closure. Instead, he pulled onto the expressway without saying where we were going. When I asked, he didn't answer. He just kept driving, slowly accelerating, and when he finally spoke, it was in this eerily calm voice, telling me it didn't matter whether I took him back or not, because we would be together. He said it like a promise, like a threat. Then came the monologue, how our love was unstoppable, how no one could tear us apart, not even me. I asked again where we were going, and he smiled, this slow, unnatural smile I still can't forget, and said we were headed to a neighboring state where no one would know or find us. I called my mother from the passenger seat and put her on speaker. She begged him to turn the car around. Thankfully, he listened. But it didn't stop there. After I got home and refused to see him, he started standing outside my house through the night. He'd call me and sing songs over the phone, slow, creepy songs about burning my house down and offing everyone inside if I didn't come out and talk to him. To this day, I still don't understand how someone can look so calm while being that dangerous. Story 5. My nephew, technically through marriage, is, for lack of a better term, a deeply troubled kid. The first major incident I experienced with him happened during a family game of hide and seek when he was about 9. He didn't like where I hid, flew into a rage, and tried to hit me. I instinctively grabbed his wrist and twisted just enough to stop him. He He screamed like a banshee and bolted into another room, yelling that he needed his Nerf gun because, and I quote, he shoots people when he's mad. I looked at my sister-in-law and asked, "Seriously, you're okay with this?" Her response was that I had no right to touch him, that I should have just let him hit me, because he's just a boy. I told her flatly that if her kid ever so much as hinted at hurting one of my children, I'd treat him like a rabid dog. Harsh, maybe, but my concern was real. Thankfully, the rest of the family, her husband, my in-laws, backed me up. They saw it for what it was, a serious red flag. 2 years later, the kid was still unpredictable. He was still just a boy, according to her, and his disturbing behavior was still being brushed off. I was staying at their house during a visit. Things seemed relatively calm, and I figured we could all just get through the weekend. One morning around 4:30 a.m., I woke up early, as usual. I stayed in bed, meditating, trying not to disturb anyone. Around 5:20, I heard the door open. I assumed it was one of my young kids. Then I looked up and saw my nephew standing there, holding what looked exactly like an AR-15. I have PTSD from Iraq. So yeah, my brain and body went straight into survival mode. My heart was pounding. I stayed quiet and watched. He crept around the bed, came to my side, and pointed the barrel directly at my face. In that moment, I truly thought I was going to die. All I could think was to stop him before he hurts my wife or kids. As he raised the rifle, I grabbed the barrel and shoved it as hard as I could, smashing the buttstock into his face. He started screaming, nose bleeding, yelling that he was going to end me. The house woke up instantly. Lights came on. Turns out the rifle was a hyper-realistic toy made to look like an AR-15. It had lights and sound effects, and he'd planned to point it at my face and pull the trigger to scare me. I was torn. I'd just bloodied an 11-year-old over a toy, but everything about what he did was disturbingly intentional. He wasn't just playing. It was another massive red flag. My sister-in-law was livid. She accused me of being unstable and dangerous and called the police, insisting I be arrested for child abuse. Despite my wife's protests, she doubled down on her story. I had attacked a child for playing with a toy. Police arrived and stayed most of the day conducting interviews. I was genuinely concerned, not just about getting arrested, but about possibly not being able to leave on time as planned. Fortunately, things didn't go in that direction. Turns out, this wasn't new behavior. The kid had a record. The school had been required to contact the police multiple times because of his frequent threats of mass violence. The officers knew about him. One of the detectives later told me their interview with him was chilling, and that he hoped my sister-in-law would finally get him some help. I told him she wouldn't. When this kid is 30 and on trial for something horrific, she'll still be insisting he was just a boy. I genuinely hope he doesn't hurt anyone, but I'm not counting on it. Since then, I've refused to stay at their house. When we visit the area, we get a hotel. He's never allowed to be alone with my children. He's also banned from my house after he was caught trying to steal a pocket knife. He claimed he needed it to perform surgery on the family cat. He was nearly 12 at the time. Edit for clarity. He has still never been arrested or forced into counseling, despite numerous threats at school. My sister-in-law is a lawyer, and while she no longer practices, she's still part of the bar. When she can't intimidate people herself, she knows enough lawyers who are willing to write threatening letters on her behalf. She even managed to get an injunction preventing the school from suspending him after one of his many incidents. This kind of legal shielding is exactly why so many red flags are ignored, until it's far too late. Story 6. I've been a public school teacher for over a decade, and in all that time, only one student ever truly scared me. It was early in my career, at an alternative school designed for students who had been expelled from every other campus in the district. Most of my students had rough pasts, sure, but if you met them where they were, showed them respect, and held your ground, they were generally manageable. But then there was JT. When I first heard of JT, he was already a kind of legend, spoken about in hushed tones by staff and students alike. At the time, I didn't teach him, but his reputation preceded him. His mother had somehow mastered the labyrinth of educational bureaucracy, filing so many 504 plans and IEP accommodations that JT was functionally untouchable. He could assault a teacher, and he did, pushing an 8 months pregnant woman to the ground, and he was back in class within 2 weeks. He punched another student in the face and returned 2 days later. Consequences simply didn't stick to him. What truly unnerved me was the fact that his own mother didn't want him at home. She was terrified of him, and with good reason. When JT was a child, he tried to burn their house down while his family slept. His younger brother, his target, was duct taped to a bed and severely harmed in the fire. Miraculously, he survived. Even more shocking, he remained loyal to JT, despite everything. JT, though small, barely 5 feet 4 inches, was relentless. Meanwhile, his now scarred brother had grown taller, stronger, and somehow still protective of the boy who tried to off him. I finally got JT in my classroom during his senior year. By then, he had maybe 10 credits to his name, mostly from gym classes. There was never a chance he'd graduate. But what struck me most was how empty he seemed, completely devoid of empathy. There was nothing behind his eyes. He never smiled unless someone was in pain. He didn't cause chaos out of impulse or frustration. It was calculated, and it was cruel. Then one day, JT didn't show up. That was odd. He ran a thriving little operation on campus, drug-related, and usually avoided trouble like an expert. The next day, we learned why he was gone. He had offed another kid, over $12 and a small amount of weed. Shot right in the face. His defense attorney argued for leniency, claiming it was technically his first offense. Everything else had happened while he was a minor. It didn't work. JT was sentenced to 25 years to life. And I've never forgotten him. Story 7. From a very young age, I remember my mom standing in the doorway of my room with a knife in her hand. It didn't happen often, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, but it was enough to be burned into my memory. When I was 9, I finally gathered the courage to ask her why she did it. I'll never forget her answer. She looked me straight in the eyes and said, completely calm, "You were a mistake. I'm deciding whether to do what I should have done a long time ago." A week later, I asked to move in with my grandmother. Even now, 22 years later, just thinking about that moment makes my heart race. I don't know how to fully describe it, but every hair on my body stood on end. I was frozen, absolutely paralyzed, because I genuinely believed that if I moved too quickly, she would off me. A little context. My mom had me when she was 16. She reminded me constantly that I had ruined her life. She struggled with addiction, drugs, alcohol, everything. She used to say that if she'd had the money, she would have aborted me. Story 8. I was 21 in 1989 when I walked into the hallway of our shared house and found him playing the electric piano. In front of him was a photo of the girl he'd been dating, and he was playing some mournful-sounding music, though not very well. "Bad breakup?" I asked, and he explained, carefully recounting how she'd accused him of being a heartless monster because he didn't react to some minor tragedy. Honestly, I've forgotten the specifics now. He went on to tell me she was right. He didn't care, and he couldn't force himself to feel anything. He didn't take pleasure in anyone's suffering, but he just wasn't moved by anything. So he said the piano and photo were his way of fitting in with the rest of you. "See, if I do this, if I act like I have feelings, people will like me more." I gave him a weird flex, but okay response, and for some reason, he took that as my approval of his lack of emotions. From then on, he'd come to me every week or so with some situation in his life and ask, how would a person with feelings react to this? He got pretty good at it. He called it his human mask. People he met after that generally accepted him as a functional human being. We've stayed friends all these years. He's now a successful financial manager because emotions don't cloud his decisions. He's married with a couple of cute kids who he describes as mostly gibbering animals, but sometimes they think. His wife seems happy, though I suspect she doesn't realize his emotional detachment. He rescued her from a toxic situation, so she might feel like she's better off. Every year around her birthday, their anniversary, or Christmas, he calls me to run gift ideas by me. He's smart enough to know that the typical, cliché gifts are the wrong move, but he can't seem to put himself in his wife's shoes and figure out what she'd truly want. Fortunately, I'm good at it, and her reactions to his gifts show it. Edit, in response to many comments. He's not autistic, at least not in any significant way. What we would have called a psychopath before the DSM-V changes. Multiple therapists have agreed with this assessment. He has a flat affect, no remorse. He was raised in a stable, loving home, but he followed his parents' rules because he understood they were necessary to avoid consequences, not because he understood or cared about the reasons behind them. He thrives in business because it allows him to be as cutthroat as he wants without facing real consequences, as long as he stays within the law. His main goal is status and wealth, and he has both in abundance. He treats his wife and kids well because it maintains his status. If he treated them poorly, others would talk. He once said that if he'd been born in caveman times, he'd have been the guy guarding the camp while everyone else slept. Story 9. My aunt has 2 adopted children, both of whom came from drug-addicted mothers. One of them, Jane, is my age, and we were really close growing up. Her older brother, John, on the other hand, never really interacted with us, to the point that I barely knew him, despite spending a lot of time at their house. When we were around 12, Jane, my sister, and I built a huge blanket fort in the basement and were hanging out inside it. John, who was about 15 at the time, came in for some unknown reason. For whatever it was worth, he decided to mess with us by taking a large kitchen knife and randomly destroying the fort. We tried to crawl away, but he could hear us and would follow us wherever we went. I can't imagine how blindly running at your relatives with knife could ever be considered playful, but that definitely wasn't the case here. Jane was screaming at him to stop, and my sister and I were crying, absolutely terrified. Finally, my aunt heard us yelling and came down to yell at John. He claimed it was just a joke, that we were all having fun. Now, he's serving a 25-year prison sentence for murder. Story 10. I'm not really sure how to label this, but I had a friend with some serious rage issues. He'd snap over absolutely nothing, and it was terrifying to watch. One day, we were all on the tram, goofing around and being loud, as we tended to be. One of my friends jokingly said to the angry guy, "Hey, that guy talked crap about your mom," while pointing at some random guy. It was obviously a joke. Why would a random stranger even do that? But the rage guy completely lost it. The guy who talked crap got off at the next stop, and my friend followed him. What happened next is the most brutal thing I've ever witnessed. The guy walked up behind the stranger and punched him out of nowhere. The guy hit the ground, and then my friend kicked him at least 4 times in the head, plus a few more to his body. By the way the guy fell, it was clear he was knocked out by the first punch, so the kicks were just completely unnecessary. Then, as the guy lay there, unconscious and bleeding, my friend spit on him and mumbled something about not talking crap. Afterward, he started laughing and looked at us, still in shock, before saying, "Hoopsie, sorry," and shrugged as if it was no big deal. Then, he noticed a woman who was shocked and pulling out her phone to call the cops. He laughed again and said, "Yeah, call the cops, bish, and an ambulance. This guy needs it," as she dialed. Then he took off running, laughing as he disappeared down the street. It was all so surreal. It was like he didn't even realize what he had just done. I later found out that the guy had suffered brain damage and was seriously injured. One of my other friends told the rage guy about it, and he apparently didn't care at all. I didn't want to hang out with him after that, but I kept hearing other stories from friends. Like how he once threw a chair out a window at a pizzeria over something trivial, or how he used to flick cigarette butts at gas station pumps because wouldn't it be cool if it blew up? Story 11. I'd always wondered about them. We were friends as teenagers because they were exciting to be around. They'd do anything, no matter how dangerous or embarrassing or stupid. As we got older, I noticed that they still kept doing these things without care or consideration for others. They taunted me often, apparently just to see how I'd react. Then one day their partner offed themselves, and I tried to offer support. They weren't upset that their 10-year-old had found their partner. Then they revealed that they'd told their partner to off themselves, just to see what would happen. We're no longer friends. Story 12. When I was in primary school, a classmate invited me over to his house after school. He didn't have many friends. This was a private school, and most kids looked down on him because he only attended thanks to his dad, who worked as the school's groundskeeper. I didn't really want to go, but I also didn't want to be cruel like everyone else, so I agreed, though I made it clear I couldn't stay long. We ended up behind his house, in a patch of yard where the grass was oddly bare in several spots. Some of the spots had a single stick poking out of the center. Others had thin plastic tubes sticking up from the dirt. He was clearly excited and started digging at one of the patches, pulling out a jar with a small bird inside that had already passed away. The lid had a hole, and a plastic hose ran through it. He explained that it was there to let air in. Then he told me matter-of-factly that he liked burying things alive. Sometimes he sealed the jars tight. Other times, he'd add air tubes, and occasionally even a bit of food and water to keep whatever was inside alive longer. He said if you buried them too deep, you couldn't hear them scratching and trying to escape. And sometimes, when he felt like it, he'd pour water down the tubes to drown them. I was somewhere between 8 and 10 years old at the time. I'm 52 now, and it still makes me sick to think about it. Story 13. A few years back, after I'd moved to a new city, my best friend came to visit. We're both in our 30s, just out catching up over drinks. We were sitting outside at a bar when this guy asked if he could join us. There weren't any free tables. No big deal, we said sure. He seemed friendly enough at first, so we made small talk. He told us he was a truck driver, just stopping overnight, and somewhere along the line mentioned he'd served in the military. Nothing too unusual at first. But the conversation started to take a weird turn, gradually, like a frog in boiling water. It wasn't just that he was ex-military, he had a brother in the CIA. Embedded in Russia, no less. Or maybe it was his twin. Details were fuzzy. As we kept talking, it started to feel like he was oddly fixated on us. Not aggressive, just overly interested. We decided to switch bars, hoping to lose him, but he tagged along. That's when his stories started to spiral. The brother in the CIA didn't exist. He was the one who'd been deep undercover in Russia. And he told us this with total seriousness, like we were in on some covert op. The weirdest part wasn't the story. It was how serious he was about it. Completely straight-faced, but with this rising intensity that started to make my skin crawl. He began picking fights with other patrons, not directly with us, but clearly trying to show how volatile he could be. Like a warning. Then, as if things weren't already strange enough, he pulled me aside, dropped into a terrible Russian accent, and confessed that he wasn't a spy for the US at all. He was a double agent. A sleeper cell. A one-man Russian plant who just couldn't bear lying to me anymore. He had to tell someone the truth. At that point, we were done. He went to the bathroom, and my friend and I left everything behind, open tabs, cards, whatever, and bolted. We never saw him again. Story 14. Back in high school, or maybe just after, there was a party where we were doing the usual dumb late-night stuff. Drinking, getting high, and playing truth or dare. I knew almost everyone there, except for the new boyfriend of my friend's sister. I don't remember exactly how the conversation got there, but at some point, in front of the whole group, this guy admitted that he had essayed a dog. Just said it. We were all under the influence, but that statement hit like a brick wall. The entire room sobered up instantly. We were young, shocked, and honestly had no idea how to process something like that. No one said anything. We all just went silent and started leaving. My friend's sister broke up with him not long after. I still can't wrap my head around the cruelty of it, but what really stuck with me was how casually he confessed it to a group of people who barely knew him. It felt disturbingly sociopathic. I've never seen him again, and I'm grateful for that. Story 15. At a party once, I met a friend of a friend who worked as a nurse at a local hospital. She had that particular kind of presence, someone who sighed dramatically and leaned on the intensity of her job to draw attention. She clearly enjoyed being the center of the room and was quick to dive into how demanding her work was. When I asked if there were parts of the job she actually liked, her whole demeanor shifted. She lit up and proudly told me she worked primarily in maternity. I expected stories about newborns or grateful families. Instead, she started talking, almost giddily, about the power she held over her patients. She described how vulnerable women were during and after childbirth, how she was often the only one on the floor who could detect when something was about to go catastrophically wrong. She spoke with this eerie pride, almost reverence, about how their lives were in her hands. Not in a compassionate or selfless way, but as if their fragility gave her purpose. Later, the group drifted into lighter conversation, high school memories and such, and she pulled the spotlight back. She shared how she'd once been rejected from an advanced choir, and, without missing a beat, blamed it entirely on the choir director's poor judgment. Then, with an unsettling sense of satisfaction, she added that years later, she sang at his funeral. The pride she took in having control over people, in watching them suffer, even has stuck with me. It felt like the most casual, undiluted form of evil I've ever witnessed. Story 16. We were in high school when I finally called her out for manipulating people into being her friend, including me, and for the constant emotional bullying. She retaliated by telling the entire school I was pregnant. I wasn't, but in a very small, very religious school, that rumor was toxic. It took a lot of time and effort to put it to rest. In response to being confronted, she came to my house under the guise of apologizing. Then she accused my mother of slapping her during the visit. It was a complete fabrication, But the damage she caused was enough that my parents and I decided I would transfer schools the following semester to get away from her. On my very first day at the new school, she came running up to me, all smiles, going on about how she'd told her mom she wanted to switch schools too, just so she could be with me. It took another 2 years and a pile of documented incidents before the school finally stepped in. My mom and I were ready to involve the police for stalking and harassment. That was the turning point. Only then did her mother finally back down and agree to keep her away from me. Up until that moment, she was convinced we were best friends and insisted her daughter had done nothing wrong. It took years to undo the damage. But she's out of my life now. Story 17. There were a lot of red flags with him, more than I wanted to admit at the time. He was almost certainly a closeted bi man, which isn't an issue in itself, but the way he handled it, especially in the context of his behavior, was troubling. He was a college theater professor with a long trail of broken relationships behind him. His pattern was disturbingly consistent. He would seek out emotionally vulnerable young men in the department, usually guys who had just gone through a breakup or had strained or absent relationships with their fathers. Many of them were grieving, lonely, or simply looking for guidance. He'd swoop in, flood them with attention and praise, and make them feel like they'd finally found a mentor or best friend. He didn't always pursue these guys intimately, though I suspect he did with some, but what he really fed on was adoration. He loved being the center of someone's world, being idolized. Once he had that, he'd start subtly undermining them, backhanded compliments, quiet digs, emotional yo-yoing. When they started forming their own identities or found new relationships, he'd discard them cold. He once told me, completely seriously, that he only related to people through caricatures he created of them. A black friend of ours was the loud black woman. Another friend grieving his dad was Eeyore. That wasn't a joke to him. It was his framework for understanding people. He couldn't see others as whole human beings. He had no ability for genuine self-reflection. If you confronted him about something, he might apologize, but it was hollow, just enough to pacify you. There was never real accountability. And the man was a functioning alcoholic, often showing up to lectures and rehearsals drunk and later laughing about it like it was some charming quirk. He was also a compulsive liar. He was nearly 40, but tried to convince students he was in his late 20s, so they'd hang out with him. He constantly ignored boundaries. At his house, he'd jokingly expose himself and then act confused or hurt if you didn't laugh along. I was one of the guys he emotionally manipulated. It took me a while to realize how toxic the relationship was, and how completely inappropriate it was for a man his age to form these obsessive, controlling bonds with 19 and 20-year-old students. When I finally cut ties, he flipped instantly, from love bombing to cold hostility. Later, my wife and I were visiting mutual friends who had once let him crash at their place during COVID when he lost housing. They had since cut him off too. During that visit, they told us they'd run into someone from his high school who said, without hesitation, "I'm so glad you got away from him. There's something wrong with that guy. He's dangerous." Looking back, I couldn't agree more. Story 18. We used to be friends with him and his sister. At first, everything seemed normal, but over time, we noticed something strange. He never showed much emotion beyond anger. That was our first red flag. Things escalated when one of our friends started dating his sister. Not long after, he pulled that friend aside and warned him, very calmly, that if he ever hurt his sister, he wouldn't hesitate to hurt him in return. Our friend was visibly shaken. He believed him completely. That was the second red flag. The final one came after a tragic car accident of their family. His father and sister passed away on the scene. His mother was hospitalized for observation, and he was admitted with a few broken bones. A few of us went to visit him at the hospital, but he seemed completely detached, unbothered, unemotional. There was no grief, no shock, just an eerie emptiness. The hospital was a teaching facility with psychiatric staff, and one of the doctors stopped by to check in on his mental state. When they asked if he'd like to talk to someone, he responded flatly, "Why would I need help?" His mother, to her credit, pushed for a formal evaluation. That's when he was diagnosed as a psychopath. After that, his mom essentially devoted her life to teaching him how to function in society, how to mimic empathy, understand the difference between right and wrong, and follow social rules and laws. She did everything she could to help him live as normally as possible, but the truth was always just beneath the surface. It was chilling, realizing how long we'd known someone without truly seeing who they were. Story 19. I had a friend who always seemed a little off, low on empathy, but I brushed off a lot of the warning signs. She was a wild party girl, and her relationship with her mom was strangely hostile, as if she was constantly at odds with her. I also noticed she could be pretty cruel to people, often acting like she was better than them. I was a vulnerable teenager who struggled to make friends, so I convinced myself to ignore these things because she was always cool with me. Then came the moment that really changed everything. She got extremely drunk, slept with my boyfriend, and then they both called me together to mock me about it. The humiliation was beyond anything I could have imagined. What was even more bizarre, though, was the way she acted the very next week. She approached me as if nothing had happened, laughing it off as just a bit of fun. I knew in that moment that she was a bad person, but what really shook me was how completely unaware she was of why I would want nothing to do with her. She seemed genuinely surprised that I was distancing myself. Since then, I've heard updates about her from mutual friends, and it's clear this isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern that continues into her adult life. She treats everyone around her like a disposable amusement, with no real understanding of how hurtful her behavior is. She doesn't mask or manipulate. Everything she does is blunt, and it's as though she never registers the impact her actions have on others. Losing friends doesn't seem to faze her at all. She doesn't get defensive or demand an explanation like, "How dare you be mad at me?" Instead, she just seems baffled that people are so sensitive. Story 20. I have a friend who is clinically diagnosed as a psychopath, and they're incredibly intelligent. Every once in a while, they do or say something that felt off, like not understanding why someone would be upset by something that was clearly hurtful. After witnessing this behavior over several years, I asked them directly if they felt emotions like sadness or empathy. They confirmed that they didn't. I then asked specifically if they were autistic to rule out the possibility that they were missing social cues or expressing emotions in a different way. They clarified that they were not autistic, but a clinical psychopath, with genetic testing to back that up. They explained that if they wanted to, they could easily choose to be evil, but that they consciously chose to use their brain for good. As a result, they're very generous financially with their loved ones. They're highly intelligent, skilled at manipulation, but they tend to apply those talents in ways that lead to positive outcomes for others. Emotionally, they are very non-reactive. They have to carefully observe situations and figure out how to process emotions they don't naturally feel. They're also incredibly funny and charismatic. For them, everything seems to come down to numbers. Even when they choose to do positive things, I get the sense they view generosity as a kind of net gain, rather than something that feels good in an emotional sense. They're amazing at games, especially ones like Monopoly. They're absolutely ruthless when they play. I love them deeply. They are honestly one of the best people I've ever known. My mom once asked me if I ever worried they would hurt me, and I told her that I actually feel way less concern about them than I do about some of my non-psychopath friends. With my friend, it wouldn't make any logical sense for them to hurt me. Their lack of emotional reaction makes them incredibly stable, and I find them much more enjoyable to be around than many other people. Story 21. My mom was just 19 when I was born, and when I was younger, we had a really close relationship. She was more of a friend than a mom, and that's just how we connected. Before my stepdad came into the picture, I was always sarcastic, and we joked around all the time. One morning, my mom asked me to take the pizza boxes from the previous night's dinner out to the garage for the cardboard recycling. I jokingly told her no as I gathered up the boxes, but I still went out and placed them on top of the stack in the garage. When I turned around to head back inside, I bumped into my stepdad, who had come in quietly behind me. Without warning, he grabbed me, lifted me off the ground, and pinned me against the wall. He was yelling in my face about disrespect, and I could feel spit landing on me as he screamed. My feet were back on the ground, but his hands were still holding me. In a panic, I grabbed one of his hands with my mouth, biting and scratching to get him off. I don't remember what happened after that. I don't remember how I ended up at school, but the next thing I recall is sobbing in a private room in the band hall. My mom still doesn't believe me. Over the next 2 years, things only got worse. My relationship with my mom completely fell apart. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow whenever he was home. I ran away, started using drugs, anything to escape. Eventually, my behavior became so out of control that my mom sent me to live with my biological father. Life is better now. I'm safe. I still get the occasional nightmare and can't stand confrontation, but I'll be okay. Story 22. I grew up with an abusive father, both physically and emotionally. The physical abuse started early but began to ease off when I was around 11 or 12, mostly because my older brother, who was the golden child, started copying the way my father treated me. The abuse shifted more into emotional manipulation, but it never truly stopped. When my parents divorced, my brother went off to a boarding school for a year, which left me alone with my father. After the divorce, things only got worse. My father, having just lost his wife, increased his emotional abuse, and it was especially bad after I spent weekends with my mom. Anyone who's dealt with an abuser knows that control is everything. After the divorce, my father insisted that my brother and I stay with him. But my brother went away to boarding school, and my father lost his job. We had to move because the house was too expensive, and for someone like my father, that was a lot of control to lose, especially on top of the divorce. The abuse escalated. One weekend, I was at my mom's and got very sick with the flu. I ended up staying with her for a week. The plan was for me to go to school from her place, and then return to my dad's afterward. I dreaded going back, but I didn't know any better. I was 13, and I didn't understand what abuse was at that time. When I got home that day, my dad wasn't there. I was relieved. He didn't come back until after I had badminton practice. I made myself some dinner, and then went to practice. I got home around 9 p.m., and that's when it hit. My dad was furious. He screamed at me, demanding to know where I'd been. He said he had called everyone and nobody knew where I was, and that I was supposed to come straight home from school. I was so confused. I told him that I had badminton practice, just like I had every Monday for the past 3 years. But instead of understanding, he got even angrier. He yelled at me for not telling him every time I went somewhere, and how if it was always Monday, I should have written it on the fridge calendar. He raged at me for what seemed like hours, blaming me for everything wrong in his life. I couldn't even process what was happening. His anger was so overwhelming that I just felt empty afterward. I went to my room, trying to make sense of it all, but all I could feel was shame. That's a side effect of growing up in an abusive environment. You always end up blaming yourself, even when it's not your fault. Then, out of nowhere, he stormed up the stairs, barged into my room, and ordered me to get in the car. "We're going for a drive," he said. I'll never forget that feeling. In all my 30 years, I've never been as scared of dying as I was in that car, sitting in silence, waiting for him to get in. I honestly thought he was going to end me. It turned out we were just going to look at a house he was considering moving to. But he got mad at me for not asking where we were going. In that moment, I realized how irrational and unpredictable he could be. I don't talk to my father, my brother, or my mother anymore. I've cut ties with all of them. Story 23. I'm pretty sure the last guy I dated might have been a sociopath. He only cared about himself, and nothing else seemed to matter to him. When his mom passed away from cancer, it was like he didn't even care. He never mentioned whether they had a strained relationship, and the few times I met her, she seemed really nice. His response to her death? "Oh, cool, now she won't be around to nag me all the time." That was it. No sign of grief, no emotional reaction at all. When my grandfather passed away, his response to me was simply, "So what? It's just your grandpa." I got zero emotional support from him. It was as though anyone else's pain was just something to brush off. He never took no for an answer. If I didn't want to sleep with him, he'd manipulate me until I gave in. And this happened right after I found out my grandpa had passed away. It was like he couldn't care less about my emotions. He was charming around others, especially strangers, to get whatever he wanted. Then, he'd tell me later how easy it was to manipulate them, like it was some kind of game. Everyone thought he was the sweetest guy, but I was the one who saw the real side of him and suffered through his tactics. He was vegan, but I always had the feeling it was just a way for him to appear compassionate. He'd constantly talk about how everyone should go vegan for the animals, yet he'd laugh at videos of animals being mistreated. Nothing extreme, but still disturbing. Later on, he got a tattoo to mark the anniversary of his mom's death. But he also told me he planned to get similar tattoos for his dad and brothers and fill them all in when they passed away. That felt wrong. Like he was almost waiting for them to pass away early, too. After we broke up, one of my friends finally opened up to me about the abuse she had suffered from him for years. She was the one who introduced us, but he had forced her to do it. I had no idea at the time, but looking back, it's clear now. It's been a while since then, but apparently, he's still obsessed with me and believes we'll get back together eventually. Thankfully, he's broke and lives several states away, so I don't really worry about him finding me anymore. Story 24. My younger stepbrother struggled with a range of mental health issues, most notably what seemed to be conduct disorder, likely stemming from neglect during his early years with his biological mother. Despite my parents doing everything they could to get him professional help, and I mean everything, nothing seemed to truly break through. It's hard to even know where to start when describing what it was like growing up with him. He'd pick fights over the smallest things, sometimes escalating to violence. In the early years, that violence was mostly limited to things like punching walls, but as he got older, it started to become more concerning. On a personal level, our relationship was actually decent. I was his favorite sibling, and since he was smaller than me, I never felt physically threatened until he started hiding weapons. I'll never forget the day our parents found a large kitchen knife tucked under his bed. When they confronted him, he exploded into a full-blown rage, screaming, swinging fists, completely out of control. Even though he was only about 5 feet tall, it took multiple siblings to restrain him. I can't recall if he actually said he wanted to off anyone during that episode, but the threat felt real, especially considering he had made death threats before. What terrified me most was that this was the first time I saw what looked like the early stages of him acting on one. Our bedrooms were next to each other, and since my door didn't lock, I had to teach myself to sleep lightly, just in case. Things fluctuated through high school, and I never fully felt at ease under the same roof as him. When I left for college, I distanced myself selfishly in some ways and tried not to think about the chaos I'd left behind. But the story doesn't end there. Eventually, he moved in with other family members for a while, then set out on his own surprisingly young. He went through a couple of rough years, no contact with home, refusing any offers of help, but somehow managed to turn things around on his own. Today, he has a stable job in a big city, a steady income, and a serious girlfriend. Even more incredible, he reconnected with our family, and we've rebuilt a much healthier relationship. We've moved beyond our past, and I'm honestly proud of the person he's become. Story 25. I wasn't home when this happened, I was out of town, but my little brother filled me in on everything. So, for about a week, my parents were watching a nephew from Mexico. He was around 10 years old. Anytime my mom or my 14-year-old baby brother teased him, mostly light stuff, like calling him super macho, he'd respond by threatening to off our cat. My mom would usually just brush it off and tell him to stop being an idiot. My brother, on the other hand, started keeping an eye on him. Then came the second-to-last day of his visit. My mom told the kid to go shower because he smelled. His response, "Screw you," followed by him grabbing our cat and throwing it at my mom. According to my parents, my brother immediately jumped up from the couch, punched the kid square in the face, dragged him to the bathroom, threw him into the shower, and told him to take a bath with a toaster. That night, things escalated. The kid snuck into my brother's room while he was asleep and started rummaging through his knife collection. Now, here's where things take a weirdly cinematic turn. My brother sleeps with his wood-cutting hatchet next to him. So he hears movement, grabs the hatchet, and jumps up ready to go full lumberjack on whoever's creeping in. My parents come rushing in because of the noise. Turns out, the kid had found one of my brother's skinning knives and was pointing it at him. He admitted he was looking for that specific knife, so he cut off our cat. No one slept after that. My parents called his grandparents the next day and told them that the kid needs serious psychological help. But their response? Classic old-school Mexican grandparent energy. He just needs to find Jesus and pray. This kid is 10 years old. For context, my brother is a history and outdoors nerd. He's super into Russian gear, seizing the means of production, and antique weapons. He's never hurt an animal in his life. In fact, he runs outside to scare coyotes off whenever they get too close to our dogs. Our cat is indoors, thankfully. He collects knives for the design work on the handles, but he does have his own set of cool blades for actual use. But yeah, that week? Absolutely unhinged. Story 26. Okay, I know I'm late to the party and maybe no one cares, but the level of ignorance in this thread is frustrating. Psychopaths, sociopaths, and other terms that describe people lacking empathy, being unpredictable, self-interested, and sometimes violent, all fall under a diagnosis known as antisocial personality disorder, APD. A psychopath is typically born that way, like how autism or schizophrenia is formed in the brain during development. Unless they're particularly unintelligent or raised in a dysfunctional environment, a psychopath will usually never reveal their true nature to most people, unless they're planning on getting away before you catch on. Psychopathy is rare, affecting between 0.1% and 3% of the population. You've probably never met a real psychopath, and if you did, you wouldn't even realize it. Most psychopaths can live by social norms and be seen as decent people. On the other hand, a sociopath, though not an academically precise term, is someone who likely developed antisocial behaviors as a coping mechanism early in life. Sociopathy is more common than psychopathy, but still relatively rare. Many sociopaths are lower functioning, but some can be highly intelligent and successful in fitting into society, even if their behavior remains antisocial in nature. To be diagnosed with APD, someone has to be honest and compliant with their diagnosis, which is uncommon for people with APD. It's also more likely that people with untreated mental health issues like bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, or schizophrenia might show behaviors that seem like APD but don't actually have it. Addiction alone could explain many of the bizarre, violent actions often mistaken for psychopathic behavior, and people with delusions aren't typically psychopaths or sociopaths. Psychopaths have a firm grip on reality, and sociopaths are usually grounded in their experiences. Also, narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, is separate from APD. While some narcissists may exhibit antisocial traits, not all people with APD are narcissists. In short, human behavior and brain functions are complex, and calling every scary or erratic person a psychopath oversimplifies things. Story 27. My sister is a sociopath. It took me years to come to terms with that and to stop trying to rationalize or excuse her behavior. I'm diabetic and have been in multiple comas over the years. During one in 2015, after over a year of no contact, she suddenly showed up at the hospital claiming that I had told her I didn't want to be resuscitated. Thankfully, around a dozen of my close friends were there and immediately shut her down. I ended up waking up on my own 3 days later. But if I had coded during that time, there would have been a lot of legal gray area about whether they could revive me because of her claim. About 4 months later, she tried to take out a life insurance policy on me and asked me to sign it. I said no, obviously, and cut off all contact with her for good. This post kind of blew up, so I just want to say, I've since made my medical wishes very clear, had them legally notarized, and distributed copies to my doctors and a few trusted friends. She's not taking me out that easily. Story 28. I dated someone who I now strongly believe is a sociopath. One of the most uncomfortable things during our relationship was how he'd constantly whisper things to me in public, right in earshot of other people, like, "Do you think I look hot right now?" Or, "Do you think I'm cool?" At first, I thought he was joking, so I'd laugh, but that would instantly set him off. He wasn't joking, he wanted a serious answer. He expected me to gush about how badly I wanted him, right there, in front of everyone. And if I didn't, I'd get lectured afterward. "You really embarrassed me when you laughed like that in front of people." He could also cry on command to manipulate a situation, and the second he got what he wanted, the switch would flip. He'd go cold, serious, and tell me what a terrible person I was. Those emotional whiplash moments were deeply unsettling. When he broke up with me, I went from being his favorite person to the absolute bottom of his list. He laughed at me while I cried, more than once, mocking me for being so dramatic. What's truly disturbing about people like him is how well they charm others. None of his current friends know what he's actually like behind closed doors. All of them are new. He cycles through people. Anyone who started catching on to his behavior while we were together is gone from his life now. He's told his new circle that I'm the psychopath because I tried to warn people. So anytime I speak up, I get attacked by his new defenders, people who have no idea they're being manipulated. Also, there's something really eerie about how he carries himself. His face and eyes are completely blank until someone interacts with him. Then it's like a switch flips and he becomes animated, like he's putting on a character just for the moment. Story 29. My uncle. We only discovered the full extent of what happened in bits and pieces over time. He and my dad worked together, but things took a dark turn when my uncle sabotaged him, spreading lies to their boss that got my dad fired. Then, in a twisted move, he swooped in like a savior and offered my dad a job in another country, where he was living at the time. Money was tight for us, we were drowning in debt, and this seemed like a lifeline, so my dad accepted. But once there, it became clear this wasn't help, it was exploitation. My dad was given a job, sure, but he was also made into a servant for my uncle's wife and kids. He had to cook their meals, wash their dishes, clean up after them at the table, and only then was he allowed to eat. He didn't tell us any of this at the time. My uncle set strict, degrading rules. Dad wasn't allowed to contact us often, had to stay quiet even when things went wrong, like when his daughter didn't come home at night, and he had to keep his head down at work. He was miserable. But we didn't know, and he didn't want to worry us. That job, awful as it was still keeping us afloat financially. Meanwhile, back home, my uncle would drop by regularly, every morning and evening, eating the meals my mom kindly prepared, all while bad-mouthing my dad in front of us. He painted himself as the noble helper and made Dad out to be a burden. I finally broke down one day and cried at the table because I couldn't take how cruel it all was. My dad was trying so hard, and this man was mocking him in his own home. And my uncle? He just sat there across from me with this chilling smile. I'll never forget that psycho grin. Then one day, completely unannounced, my dad showed up at our door. Turns out my uncle had just dumped him, sent him back without notice. Dad couldn't even bring himself to talk about what happened. That's when we really started to put the pieces together. It became clear, my uncle is a textbook manipulator. He preys on people who are vulnerable, offering them help just to make them dependent, then breaking them down with psychological control. If you disagreed with him, he'd threaten to cut you off or get you fired. He did this to others too, not just Dad. The aftermath was brutal. My dad was in a terrible state, swinging between deep depression, long silences, bursts of anger, and total despair. I even got hit a couple of times just trying to calm him down. It took cutting all ties with that man before Dad slowly began to heal. Last we heard, my uncle's been trying to reconnect with my dad, claiming we're brothers. But now that people are seeing through him, most avoid him too. As for my dad, his response, oh hell no. Story 30. She came late to our date, immediately ordered a drink and burger, then told me she was late because of a family thing. Before the burger arrived, she mentioned she'd have to cut our date short because she was having a family dinner. I was like, okay, all good. Then she told me that the craziest thing had happened where her sister met a dude on Tinder, and they ended up going to a family barbecue, and it ended up with them getting married. Before her burger even arrived, she said, wouldn't it be funny to pull a prank on my family? Like, you and I went to my family barbecue and let everyone assume we were really hitting it off, and they'd totally think we were going to get married. I'll admit I'm also the psychopath in this story, because I went. Good mashed potatoes. She spent all night introducing me as her future fiancé, and I had to take a Tinder break after that. Story 31. I used to have a friend who was a pathological liar. Most of his heritage was Scottish, northern Scotland, where Viking influence runs deep. He was a massive guy, 6 feet 8 inches, around 350 pounds when he was watching his weight, and well over 400 when he wasn't. And a lot of that was muscle. Most of his lies were relatively harmless. He had a reputation as a captivating storyteller, and everyone knew he embellished for effect. But the lying wasn't just for fun. He couldn't hold down a relationship because of it. He'd cheat, lie, and get caught within weeks, over and over again. There was always a story, always a twist, but never any real accountability. One day, we were in a cab together. He was mid-sentence telling me some wild tale when he suddenly stopped cold. He had decided the driver was taking the long way. In an instant, his entire demeanor shifted. His face hardened, and in a voice I'd never heard before, loud, sharp, and furious, he barked at the driver. It wasn't just angry, it was dangerous. The cabbie pulled over immediately and let us out, didn't even ask for the fare. Honestly, it was a good thing, because for a moment, I genuinely thought my friend might lose control. It felt like he could snap and hurt anyone within reach. I sat there frozen, heart pounding. I'd never been so afraid in a car, and it wasn't because of the route we were taking. That was the last time I spent time with him, even though we'd been friends for 20 years. Later, another mutual acquaintance told me something that stuck. He doesn't keep people around after they've seen him snap. And yeah, I guess that tracks. Story 32. I'm friends with someone I believe to be a legitimate psychopath. Just to clarify, being a psychopath doesn't always mean someone is violent, erratic, or out of control. Some are fully functional in society. That's the case with my friend, G. G is smart, very smart. He's quick-witted, always ready with a joke, and surprisingly open-minded. You can talk to him about absolutely anything. He doesn't judge, mostly because he just doesn't care. That detachment makes him easy to talk to, even though there's something unsettling under the surface. He has a shallow sense of morality, no qualms about manipulating people, and a casual willingness to rip others off, especially when money is involved. He's capable of physical violence, too, but only when pushed. He's intimidating, no question. And yet, I've never personally been burned by him. Unless you count the time we went into business together, and I somehow ended up losing money while he didn't. The creepiest conversations we've had, he knows I feel this way, are when he starts talking about society and morality. He genuinely believes that the weak and stupid, his words, not mine, shouldn't be allowed to thrive. Not based on race, gender, or anything like that. He's not a bigot, but he sees intelligence, looks, and capability as superior traits, and doesn't think people without those deserve the same chances. He suggested they be weeded out or put on farms, again his words. It's deeply unsettling stuff, and totally devoid of empathy. He just doesn't feel for others. But here's the twist. He's also practical. He has no real interest in acting on those beliefs. He knows they won't benefit him, so he keeps them to himself unless he's in the mood to provoke a philosophical debate. He's a businessman through and through. He lives for profit and the game of outsmarting people. It's not about malice, it's about the thrill. Despite all that, he's helped me out of tight situations just for the entertainment value. He gets bored easily and finds people like me interesting. I think that's why we stayed close. He sees me as someone on his level, whatever that means. We've been friends for about 7 years now. We were especially close for 3 of those before he moved to another city. I even stayed at his place for a couple of weeks in 2016. We still talk, and we're open about his psychopathy. I'm fascinated by it, and he doesn't mind being studied. He's scary, sure, but he's also strangely loyal in his own twisted way. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.